said she would get started.
Cool. So I think the only one on the agenda is the one I put in, and I started looking at the results just based on what we've seen so far. And I know, Pedro, you shared it on socials. I shared it on social. I also shared it in the Hacker News thread where people were complaining about code review divs because I was like, oh, well, this will be a prime audience.
Yeah, thanks for doing that.
I'm not sure that's the audience we want, but it's the audience we're getting. So I guess my initial sort of like feeling, and I'm curious if this is the right way to read this, is basically everything clustered between like 6.7 and 8. The bulk of them are there, and even in the low 8s, almost all of them are within that sort of like 1.5. The mean is within like 1.5. But then they all have a standard deviation of like nearly 4, which I think, if I'm reading that correctly, is they could all move anywhere within that range, and they're all sort of like equally weighted almost. And so I was just trying to get a sense if that was true. And then I also anecdotally said, it's interesting that the sort of the finding appropriate reviewers for AMR is the least popular thing on the list, even though that's the thing that we've sort of we're working on. So interesting to see that.
Yeah, this is a great question. So I think I had to read up on or update my knowledge of standard deviation, but if we had, where did I have this? Sorry, let me see if I can find what I was looking at. Okay. So if I'm not mistaken, if we were to have a very big variation of score, so for example, if the dealing with large MRs was ranked as the number one problem by one person, and then the second person would rank them in last as the least important problem, we would have, because we have 14 values in total, the standard deviation would be half, so it would be 7. So standard deviation of 7 would be the worst. It would be saying like it's all over the place. And as close as we can get to 1, or even less than that, that would be the ideal. So I don't know if it's saying that all are equally important. What definitely is true is that there's a large cluster. So dealing with large MRs, let me share my screen so we're all looking at the same thing. So dealing with large MRs, no one so far has ranked this as the least important problem, and it has the highest mean. So it's looking like there's a consensus about this being the top problem. And everything else, this one 6.6, almost 7. And then, yeah, basically all of these here, from understanding the broader impact of changes until communicating, understanding intention of comments, they all share more or less a similar mean. And then this one is a bit off, but still closer. I don't know. It's a bit early to say, but I don't think that there's a lot of variation. I think there's a lot of indecision in the middle, maybe. But Yeah, so but back to your point about, like, we know performance on LargeMRS is a real problem. Should we start thinking about some different user experiences here?
And actually, I'm very curious to see like how this response are different from their org size or maybe their tier, because I cannot see the correlation in this data, but maybe there are. We never know.
Yeah, also that. So when I was planning the sample size for this, the ideal sample size, I have a very high level of confidence, would be almost 400 responses. We're 50 and we're aiming at 100 responses. Catherine said that having 100 responses would be fine. And let me just catch up on what the internal survey looked like, because I don't remember where dealing with LargeMRS was. I think it was the second or third. I'm opening it up. Let me see. Okay, so in the internal survey, yeah, exactly. So dealing with large LMRs was also the number one. And then knowing what had happened since I last visited an MR, and then from here down, it was more or less similar rankings, almost 7 until 8. So this one until this one. So dealing with large MRs, knowing what had happened since I last visited an MR, and understanding the broad impact of changes. And here we're seeing the same thing, like the 3 top problems are also the 3 ones, top problems internally. It looks that way. But this gives, so back to your point, dealing with large MRs, it was ranked number 1 internally. So far, it's also ranked number 1 externally. Yes, I think, yeah, there's a big problem with that. I think partially, as we've recognized, and we, in the internal survey, we had an open response field that would allow people to say what they consider a large MR. And a lot of them talked about files and number of files. And it was mostly down to also the performance. So I don't know if what people are responding and saying, hey, this is a big problem for me. I don't know if it's due to the experience, due to the just the performance, or both. And looking at the Hacker News post of the 1310 release, a lot of people were complaining just about the performance, or at least that's their perception. Like, if people, when they're giving their feedback, they might not be accurate about exactly what is the problem, but they use the term performance to describe their problems. So should we start thinking about some different user experiences here? Definitely. One of the things that would alleviate this the most is the automatic switch to single file mode. But we haven't made any progress there. And I'm happy to switch this around and start thinking more about that, instead of thinking about the catching up, because this week I had planned to start synthesizing information on the catching up part, and unread files, unread diffs, unread comments. And I'm happy to switch that around and focus on this performance part and what we can do to alleviate that. Let me bring up the issue so that we can all see there. yeah, so I linked there to the issue. A good thing about this issue is that there's almost a proposal in place. I did a lot of research on it, looking at research papers, and I also asked Nick Thomas for some help to look at our own projects and understand how many files or how many lines changed do the big MRs have or do the big commits have, so that we can decide on a good way to break down this experience. So if you see in the issue, we have this section for files change and lines change, and this is a summary of across the GCC project, the GitLab FOSS project, and the GitLab project. And you can see for files changed, you have these as t-shirt sizes. There's the size categorization technique is described here. And you can already see the accumulation in this medium range about the number of files changed and the number of lines changed. And these map kind of well to what the feedback that users have given us that they consider a large MR to be. But the user's perception, I don't think it can be very trusted because it's very difficult for you to know or to remember like what you would consider a large MR to be, like the exact number of files or the exact number of lines that were changed. So yeah, this is a way that we can, and something I had already explored doing that would alleviate a lot of the pain, but it would probably require some more work and some validation on it.
Do you think that's the right issue? I know it gets floated a lot as like automatically enter single file mode. And I was scrolling it, and Phil's comment is down there, like under that table you were just showing. And his comment is like, well, what if there's 30 files, but me as a reviewer, because of being front end, I only need to review 9 of those files. And what if we just didn't show you the other 20 files? And like, that seems like a potentially more rational, but much harder thing to solve. And I just wonder, it would be sort of nice to like action this quickly and drop you into this mode. But on the other hand, I wonder if it's the right path, or if there are other things that we could be doing to deal with large MRs before we get to this point where like, we cheat and put you in single file mode. And I say cheating because it feels like a cop out almost, right? Like we're sort of saying like, we can't design an experience. We don't know what the user experience should be, and we don't know how to fix the performance issues that we have. And so our answer is like, you get to look at one file, and good luck figuring out like all of the files that are in here and like working through that and making sure you've seen all of them. Versus something that could be, infinitely more complex, but maybe is the right experience. And I don't know if we go down this like first easy win path, it makes it harder to do the other things, or makes it harder to like get back to those other experiences, or if we don't care as much or we don't do something else. I don't know. I'm just, I think this is like a thing we don't know a lot about. And I guess I don't know how we would learn a lot about it other than like, we sort of generally know people don't like the performance, but like, it's going to be different for everyone. We could also say throw more hardware at it, right? Like, you need more hardware to use a merge request with large files, right? Like that would be another answer.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's a cop out because we're not solving the root problem, which is just performance. Like in an ideal world, it would just work. It would be instantaneous, almost like a static website. You're just loading a simple HTML page and it has everything in there. And if you compare, like there's that website, what's the name? by SourceForge, and they compare the performance of different Git repositories and repository tools. And ours is the worst when it comes to diffs and things like that. And there are others that you just load them and it's really good. You're smiling. You're thinking, are we the worst? Yeah, maybe not the worst, but we're up there with, or down there with the worst. And yeah, it'll be a cop out because we wouldn't be solving the performance problems at their root. We would just changing the experience so that it's easier for users to live with the performance problems, or not experience directly the performance problems. So I think one aspect that we are not clear about the LargeMRS, and that is what we also wanted from this survey, if we remember correctly, is to understand what problems are worth investigating. So maybe we don't have all of the answers for, or don't understand exactly what dealing with LargeMRS means, or if it does it mean the same thing to everyone? Does it mean different things? But like one thing, at least to me, is clear. There's a separation between dealing with LargeMRS because it's slow in the browser, and there's a lot of files and things that need to be loaded, and so the experience is slow. And on the other hand, there's the problem of managing LargeMRS. So knowing which files you have viewed or not, jumping from file to file, jumping from in the same file from chunk to chunk. Those are also problems when you have LargeMRS. So I don't know which one is the biggest problem. I would assume, based on the feedback that we've had, that when people talk about LargeMRS, it's mostly about the performance, because that's what people more directly complain about, but it might not be true. So the first thing that came to mind was this: like, if we can't fix the performance problem, can we shift the user's attention away from that problem? And the automatic single file mode would allow to do that. I think an interesting thing that we could do is to try to find internally and externally users that only use the single file mode today in GitLab, and ask about their experience and how much that has changed their perception of performance with GitLab, to understand if it's worth doubling down on the single file mode or not. Or as Phil says, I don't know if Phil uses the single file mode, but he says, like, if I only care about 9 files and there are 30 files, why do I have to go into single file mode? Why can't you just show me the files that I need to review? So basically what I'm trying to say is that there are a lot of open questions. We just need to prioritize which questions we will go after. And as I said, I'm comfortable with shifting the focus away from the catching up to the dealing with LargeMRS, given that this was ranked as the #1 problem internally. And externally, it seems that people are also having a problematic experience with that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that makes sense to like dig in, and it's interesting that you raise the there are a lot of like nuances to LargeMRS and like what actually is the problems here, but I think universally, I think we get fairly clear feedback that performance is at least one of those problems. It's at least the one we know about today. So I like the idea of trying to find some people who exclusively use single file mode and see if we can sort of somehow do some interviews to just gauge their perception. And maybe we can find some people internally and just talk to them to start with. I do feel like switching to automatic single file mode is maybe not the right answer, but it might be the stopgap we need while we do the other work to figure out what our other options are there. And then we've also got to approach just the pure performance side of it. We've got to go back to the back end and the front end and figure out where else can we pick up performance that we don't have today. I think that's separate from what we might do feature and experience wise. I think there's probably opportunities there, and we just need to spend more time on those in a way that's focused on this as a performance issue versus like trying to drive some of these other features. And I also think we're getting to a point with, I think if we can get through require my attention and get like the attention set stuff built, I'm now like, I can't, and that you mentioned that it was very close to Garrett, I can't stop using the word attention set when I think about it. Like, I think if we get that finished, that sort of like caps off reviewers at a point where we don't necessarily need to go do anything else. Like we've got that, and we've got a way to handle what you need to go look for. We don't need to continue investing in like surfacing the people who might be the right reviewer. Like maybe that's not a thing we need to spend any more time on. Like building that algorithm to be smarter about free and busy time and subject matter expertise and other things like that. Like we just leave it alone and sort of let people continue to use the systems they have. The viewed and like progress thing, I think also the goal there is we're getting to a point where we're going to have viewed state persisted for all of your files, no matter which device you might pick it up on or which browser session or other things like that. And I think if we got that done, that sort of also gets us like the tracking stuff to like a more MVC place that we can like sort of hold off there. And sort of both of those efforts look like they're, I don't know, one or two more milestones. And if we also slot in maybe this automatic single file mode and then do some performance investigations, then we might be in a position in 2 or 3 to like make some bigger user experience changes if we want to. But that gives us time to sort of like, I think, investigate this and do this. But I guess like, I'd say sort of consensus wise, maybe this needs to be the most important thing that we're thinking about, and we sort of need to dial back feature work that is not in service of sort of the overarching performance or perception of performance of merge requests.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's hard to, I think even if I have this assumption that even if we do a lot of research on the LargeMRS, it would be very difficult to separate the hard performance problem from everything else. Not only for users, but also when we would analyze the findings and try to come up with some insights, the performance problem is so big that it blocks everything else. So it's very difficult for us to separate things and say, okay, so this is something that we can do. The performance problem is like screaming. So it's anything that we would do, like the automatic single file mode, would be just to move the focus away from that without solving the problem. when do you think we could dedicate some resources to the performance problem?
I don't know, because I mean, the other one we have that's like sort of the painful user experience, and I think we would agree we don't necessarily want to stop there, is that whole mergeability checks area. Although on the one hand, it sort of works. And
It works, yeah.
I've been hesitant to like get into it because it sort of works. And like people are like, yeah, well, there's this new bug. And this is one of those things where like you squash enough bugs and then like you don't really need to refactor it anymore because like it sort of is like in a fragile working state, and like refactoring it is just going to send you back in time. But I wouldn't expect, and especially given what's going on right now in 13.11, we're losing, issues are dropping left and right that were planned for 13.11, given the shift to database things. I feel like maybe we can also slot in an investigation issue into 14. I think one of the things though is that we need to figure out with engineering how to reframe it, because we've often looked at performance based on like those issues that come from the quality team when they're doing like endpoint testing. And there's some merit there, but there's also like the team spent, well, I mean, there was one of those for discussions where engineers spent like 6 months on it, and then we tried to roll it out and it doesn't actually work. And I wonder if we're thinking about like problems that are too big or not framed in the right way or not defined well. Like we think about it on an endpoint basis, and maybe we need to think about it on a like experience basis, which might mean we need to know what that experience is going to be. But I don't have a good answer. I just feel like when we've given performance issues that are sort of this large to engineering, we've gotten back net positives, but not, they are huge and hard and complicated and take a significant amount of time to like figure out and solve. And like versus if we could find smaller wins. So we might just need to think about that more. But I don't know what 14 is going to look like yet in terms of capacity. It'll depend on how much falls out of 13.11 that we still think we need to get done.
Yeah. Yeah, in the meantime, I'll think about this a bit more, but I'll look more closely into the single file mode and the idea I suggested to find users who exclusively use that mode to see if we can get some information there. But as I said, I'm comfortable shifting the priorities for me and focusing on that and not so much on the catching up. Because that's what the data is telling us. And we know that it's a problem. It has always been a problem. Okay. Yeah, before we part ways, Sanjang, any thoughts or comments?
I'd like to digging into the details, and as you mentioned, like maybe interview words, starting with internal first, and then see how can we improve.
Cool. Okay. Thanks. Yeah, we're over time, but we can bring this up tomorrow in the group call if you want, Kai, or not. We can just let it incubate for next time. But yeah, we have the UX department call happening, so we have to drop.
Good to see you
Thanks
guys.
so much for
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.